In December 1944, as the tides of World War II turned decisively against Japan, a young intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda stood before his commanding officer in a dimly lit bunker on the Philippine island of Lubang. The air was thick with humidity and desperation. Japan's empire was crumbling, and its soldiers were being scattered like leaves before a storm. Yet, the words spoken that day would echo through 3 decades of history. "You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand." Those were the first words of Onoda's final orders. His superior, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, looked him dead in the eyes. "You may have to live on coconuts. You may have to eat snakes. Whatever happens, you will continue your mission until I personally relieve you of duty. Do you understand, Onoda?" Onoda saluted sharply. "Hi." His loyalty was absolute. The Emperor's word was divine, his mission sacred. And so, with a pack on his back and a samurai's resolve in his chest, Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda stepped into the thick jungles of Lubang Island, unaware that he would not leave them for another 29 years. Lubang was a small, crescent-shaped island about 150 kilometers southwest of Manila. It was supposed to be a strategic stronghold, but by late 1944 it had already fallen under American control. When Onoda arrived, Japanese resistance was fractured. His orders were clear: destroy the airstrip and pier, sabotage enemy supplies, and never surrender. The island's defense was collapsing, but Onoda was not there to win battles. He was there to wage an eternal war of shadows. Alongside a handful of soldiers, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kenshichi Kozuka, Onoda began organizing guerrilla operations. He trained his men in survival tactics, camouflage, and intelligence gathering. They studied the patterns of local patrols and moved through the jungle like ghosts. Even if Japan loses the war, Onoda reminded them, we will never lose our duty. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. In February 1945, the Americans landed in force. The battle was short and brutal. Japanese forces were decimated. Yet Onoda's group slipped deeper into the mountains, carrying rifles, grenades, and the weight of an empire that no longer existed. They built shelters from bamboo, stole food from nearby villages, and listened for any sign of reinforcements. When leaflets began dropping from planes announcing Japan's surrender, they dismissed them as clever Allied propaganda. "Do not be deceived," Onoda told his men. "The enemy lies to break our spirit. We will hold out until the Imperial Army returns." It was a statement of faith, but also of tragedy. In the jungles of Lubang, the war had not ended. It had merely gone silent. The rustle of leaves became the whisper of unseen enemies. Every villager, a potential spy. For Onoda and his men, World War II was not a memory. It was the air they breathed. And so began the longest war ever fought by a single soldier. A war without front lines, without victories, and without an end in sight. The jungle was their fortress and their prison. After the American invasion of Lubang in early 1945, the remnants of Japan's defense were scattered, broken, or dead. But in the dense interior of the island, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda and his 3 men vanished into the green abyss, determined to continue the Emperor's war. The forest closed around them like a living organism, humid, relentless, and full of eyes. Giant ferns brushed against their faces, snakes slithered underfoot, and the night screamed with the cries of tropical birds. The men learned to move like shadows, to cover their tracks, to sleep in trees when the ground was too dangerous. Every sound could mean an ambush. Every light in the distance could be an enemy camp. To the locals, the Japanese soldiers became ghosts, unseen but ever present, stealing food, raiding storage huts, and vanishing before dawn. Rumors spread across the island of the spirits in the jungle, men who refused to die even after Japan's surrender. But Onoda and his men were not spirits. They were starving, mosquito-bitten, exhausted men clinging to the last thread of duty. They lived off what they could find: coconuts, bananas, and the occasional cow or pig stolen from the villages. They boiled muddy water to drink. Their uniforms rotted away, patched with whatever cloth they could scavenge. They polished their rifles daily, because a clean weapon meant discipline, and discipline meant survival. Once, Onoda wrote later, they captured a local cow and roasted it over a small fire. The smell carried through the forest, and villagers came to investigate. Shots were fired. A man fell. After that, the villagers feared the jungle even more, and the soldiers slipped deeper into isolation. In late 1945, leaflets began to fall from the sky. Printed on thin rice paper, they carried the unbelievable message. The war ended on August 15th. Japan has surrendered. You are ordered to lay down your arms. The soldiers gathered around the crumpled leaflet under a flickering oil lamp. Kozuka frowned. It's a trick, he muttered. Onoda agreed. If the war had truly ended, our command would have sent an officer, someone we recognize. To them, surrender leaflets could only be Allied psychological warfare. They burned them one by one. Then came more. Newspapers, family letters, even photographs. One bore the image of Onoda's own brother, smiling beside their parents. Hiroo, the war is over. Come home. He stared at it for a long time. Then he shook his head. They forged this. My brother would never write such nonsense. The jungle had become his world, and in that world, truth was whatever fit the mission. As years passed, their numbers dwindled. In 1949, Private Akatsu, the youngest of the group, began showing signs of exhaustion, mental, not just physical. He whispered about surrender, about seeing Manila, about going home. Onoda warned him sternly. If you leave, you'll be killed by the Americans, or worse, betray us. One night, Akatsu slipped away. For 6 months, he wandered alone, surviving on roots and luck, before finally surrendering to a Filipino patrol. The world was shocked. A Japanese soldier emerging from the jungle 4 years after the war ended. When Onoda heard the news through a stolen radio later, he grew cold. If Akatsu surrendered, he said quietly, the enemy will use him to find us. From that day on, they trusted no one. Not villagers, not leaflets, not even the sky that sometimes rained down messages of peace. Between 1945 and 1949, the trio became legends of fear. They carried out over 100 small raids, stealing rice, burning fields, and ambushing search parties they believed were enemy soldiers. To them, they were still fighting for the emperor. To everyone else, they were ghosts of a war long buried. Every shot fired by Onoda's group echoed with the madness of misplaced loyalty and the tragic nobility of men who refused to surrender. But as the 1950s approached, time itself became their greatest enemy. The jungle didn't change, but the world beyond it did. And the ghosts of Lubang were about to find themselves haunting a world that had already forgotten them. By 1950, the war that Hiroo Onoda still fought had become a ghost of memory for everyone else. Japan had risen from the ashes, its cities buzzing with rebuilding, neon signs flickering over crowded streets, and schoolchildren studying peace instead of patriotism. Tokyo was alive again, filled with jazz, optimism, and the smell of fresh industry. But far away, in the tangled jungles of Lubang, 3 men still polished rusting rifles and whispered orders into the darkness. For Onoda, the passage of time was a mystery. The seasons blurred together, rain, heat, rain again. His notebook was filled with coded reports. Enemy patrol observed near the creek. Food supplies low. Morale steady. He wrote these messages as if one day, an imperial officer would come to relieve him, to take his report and say, "Good work, Lieutenant. You have done your duty." To him, the Emperor's war was not over. It was simply waiting for orders to resume. Onoda's training as an intelligence officer had taught him never to believe the enemy, never to act without direct command, and never to assume victory or defeat. So, when American and Filipino search teams began combing the island with megaphones, shouting, "Japan has surrendered. The war is over," Onoda and his men melted deeper into the wilderness. They moved only at night, communicating with bird calls and coded knocks. They never built fires in the open, and they never stayed in one place for more than a few days. Their bodies had become lean and wiry, their uniforms tattered but still neatly repaired. To them, discipline was the only thing keeping them human. The islanders grew weary of the Japanese spirits. From time to time, villagers stumbled upon the soldiers' makeshift camps, bamboo shelters hidden behind waterfalls, cooking pits filled with ashes, footprints leading into the mist. And sometimes, the encounters turned deadly. On Christmas Day, 1950, a group of farmers discovered their missing rice sacks hanging near a stream. When they approached, shots rang out from the trees. One man fell, and the others fled in terror. That night, the villagers prayed for protection, not from ghosts, but from men who refused to stop fighting. By the early 1950s, the Philippine government knew of their existence. Patrols were organized, and planes dropped more leaflets, this time with photographs of Japanese surrender ceremonies, and even messages recorded by Onoda's own family. But nothing worked. The soldiers thought it was a trick, part of a new psychological war. "Look at the paper," Kozuka would say. "So clean. So white. You think this survived a jungle drop?" "Lies." And Onoda would nod silently. "Until the Imperial Army sends me an officer, we stay the course." Meanwhile, back in Japan, stories began to circulate about missing holdouts, soldiers who might still be fighting in forgotten corners of the Pacific. For many Japanese, it was both tragic and shameful. The nation had turned toward peace and prosperity. To hear that men still killed and died for a lost empire felt like reopening a wound. But for some, these stories stirred something deeper, a nostalgia for the old discipline, the unshakable loyalty, the spirit of Bushido that had been erased by surrender. Hiroo Onoda was becoming a myth, though he had no idea. By 1952, the Japanese government decided to send search parties composed of former soldiers and relatives of those missing. They arrived on Lubang with microphones, calling into the forest. "Onoda-san, Kozuka-san, Shimada-san, the war is over. Your families await you." From their hiding spot, Onoda and his men listened. They recognized some voices, voices from home, trembling and old. For a brief moment, Kozuka hesitated. But Onoda's command voice cut through the air like a blade. "Hold your position. If they truly were our people, they would come with proper orders. This is an enemy trap." To the end, he trusted his training more than his own heart. In 1954, tragedy finally struck. During a skirmish with a local search patrol, Corporal Shoichi Shimada was shot and killed on the beach. He died in Onoda's arms, whispering, "Tell my family I did not surrender." They buried him under palm leaves, marked by a simple bamboo cross. Now, only Onoda and Kozuka remained. Two ghosts in a war that had ended 9 years ago, still patrolling, still obeying, still waiting for an order that would never come. By 1955, the war had been over for a full decade. The Empire of Japan was now a democracy. Tokyo was glowing with the light of post-war progress. Radios played jazz instead of marching songs. Cars filled the streets, and schoolchildren learned about peace rather than the emperor's divinity. But on a tiny island far from that reborn world, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda and Private First Class Kenshichi Kozuka were still fighting. To them, the war was alive, its heartbeat hidden in the rustle of jungle leaves, in the distant bark of a rifle echoing through the trees. After Shimada's death in 1954, the jungle became even quieter. The two men built a new camp deep in the interior of Lubang, an invisible fortress made of bamboo, palm leaves, and discipline. They constructed traps, dug storage pits, and even maintained a command post, where Onoda kept his tattered notebook filled with intelligence reports and mission updates. Each morning, Kozuka would stand to attention while Onoda read out the day's orders. They patrolled the island's perimeter, checked their caches, and searched for signs of the enemy. Their rifles, cleaned daily, gleamed under the filtered sunlight. In their minds, they were still Imperial soldiers. Their mission, to disrupt Allied control, gather intelligence, and await reinforcements, remained unchanged. And so, while Japan rebuilt its cities, these two men rebuilt a war from memory and conviction. Life became ritual. At dawn, they gathered water from the streams. At night, they whispered under the sound of rain. They learned to move without leaving footprints, to identify edible plants by moonlight, to stay invisible even when only meters from passing villagers. But survival came at a cost. The boundary between reality and delusion began to blur. They started to believe that the planes occasionally passing overhead were Japanese reconnaissance, watching their progress. They imagined coded messages in the calls of birds. One time, a group of fishermen shouted into the forest that Japan had become prosperous, that peace had returned. Kozuka hesitated, saying, Maybe they're telling the truth this time." Onoda's face hardened. "If we doubt, we die?" The enemy will try to deceive us until the Imperial Army returns. Hold your faith. And Kozuka, obedient as ever, nodded. Their loyalty had become their world and their prison. By the early 1960s, the pair had been declared dead multiple times in Japan. Families of missing soldiers held memorials. Officials quietly erased their names from records. But on Lubang, the two ghosts were still alive, moving through the jungle like shadows. They raided villages for food, occasionally burning rice stores or killing livestock to avoid starvation. The villagers, terrified and angry, formed hunting parties. Filipino police exchanged gunfire with the unseen men in the hills. To them, it was a matter of survival. To Onoda and Kozuka, it was war. Onoda's discipline never wavered. He enforced the same rules he had lived by since 1944. No open fires, no exposure, and absolute obedience. He even taught Kozuka how to repair their decaying uniforms, insisting they always maintain military appearance. Every evening, they stood and saluted the invisible flag of the rising sun. They believed that somewhere, Japan still fought, and that one day, a ship would appear on the horizon to bring them home. Meanwhile, the outside world was entering the space age. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth. In 1964, Tokyo hosted the Olympic Games, showcasing Japan's rebirth to the world. But Onoda and Kozuka knew none of it. When leaflets about the Olympics were dropped from planes, they laughed bitterly. Propaganda, Onoda said. They're trying to make us believe Japan is collaborating with the Americans. Impossible. They burned the papers as they had burned hundreds before. By 1965, 20 years had passed since the emperor's surrender. The world had changed beyond recognition, but Lubang had not. The jungle remained eternal, thick, wet, humming with insects and memory. Onoda's hair had turned gray. Kozuka, once a young soldier full of faith, had grown quiet and thin. But every morning, they still stood side by side, weapons in hand, watching the sunrise over a war that existed only in their minds. The mission continued, unchanged, because for Hiroo Onoda, to surrender was to betray not just the emperor, but himself. By the mid-1960s, 20 years had passed since Japan's surrender, and the world had transformed beyond imagination. Men had walked on the moon. Televisions flickered in Tokyo apartments. Japan had become one of the fastest-growing economies on Earth, exporting cars and electronics instead of soldiers and steel. Yet deep in the jungles of Lubang Island, 2 Japanese soldiers still lived as if the empire had never fallen. The forest was no longer their ally. Logging and farming had pushed closer to their hiding grounds. Planes flew overhead more frequently. The once isolated island now carried the hum of modernity, boats with engines, radios in the villages, flashlights instead of torches. For Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda and Private First Class Kenshichi Kozuka, the world was closing in. But they didn't see progress. They saw enemy expansion. Every engine rumble was a patrol. Every construction noise was a military buildup. To them, the war was simply evolving, becoming quieter, more deceptive, more psychological. And they would not be fooled. They lived by ritual and faith. Every morning, Onoda reviewed their operational area, marking signs of human activity. They still carried out raids, burning rice stores, stealing food, slashing tires. These attacks were small but symbolic, their way of saying, Japan still fights. In their minds, every stolen bag of rice was a military victory. Every evasion of capture was a battle won. But doubt began to creep in, slowly, invisibly, like mist. Kozuka, who had followed Onoda for more than 20 years, began to change. He watched the villagers' children play with strange new toys, plastic soldiers, radios, colorful books. He heard pop songs echoing faintly from the coast. "Lieutenant," he said one night, "these people don't act like enemies. They farm, they sing. Maybe the war ended long ago." Onoda's eyes flashed in the darkness. "The enemy is clever, Kozuka. They want you to forget your duty. That is how soldiers are broken." But even as he spoke, Onoda could feel the cracks forming, not just in Kozuka's resolve, but in his own certainty. For years, he had held on to the emperor's order: never surrender. Never die by your own hand. Wait for command. But what if that command would never come? In 1969, the Japanese government once again learned that Onoda might still be alive. Filipino reports spoke of Japanese raiders seen in the jungle, 2 men carrying World War II-era rifles, attacking farms. Search teams were organized. This time, they brought newspapers, photos, and recorded messages from families. Onoda-san, the war ended long ago. A voice crackled through a loudspeaker. Japan is at peace. Come home. The men listened from the shadows. Kozuka whispered, "That's our language, that's our people." But Onoda shook his head. "If Japan had truly surrendered, our officers would have told us directly. These are enemy collaborators. Stay sharp." He clung to the structure that had defined his existence, because without it, everything he'd done for the last 25 years would mean nothing. By 1971, Kozuka's doubt became unbearable. He began to talk about going home, about surrendering. He said he wanted to see his family again, to know if Japan still remembered them. Onoda tried to reason with him. "If you leave, you'll be captured or killed. You know the enemy never stops hunting us." But Kozuka's spirit was fading. For nearly 3 decades, he had survived on duty alone, and now, that duty no longer made sense. In October 1972, the inevitable happened. Kozuka and Onoda set fire to several sacks of rice in a nearby village, part of what they still considered a sabotage mission. When local police arrived, Kozuka was shot and killed during the brief exchange of gunfire. Onoda escaped into the jungle, dragging his rifle and the unbearable weight of loss. For the first time since 1944, he was completely alone. News of Kozuka's death shocked Japan. Newspapers splashed the headline, "Japanese soldiers still fighting World War II, found in Philippines, 1972. The country was stunned. It was as if a ghost from the past had stepped out of the jungle and shouted across time. How could anyone have fought on for nearly 30 years? How could someone survive without knowing the war had ended? The Japanese government sent new search parties immediately, but this time, they weren't looking for a unit. They were looking for one man, a soldier of an empire long vanished, still obeying orders written in blood and loyalty. In the jungle, Onoda grieved in silence. He buried Kozuka with full military honors, saluting, bowing, and whispering the words, "You died a soldier. You did not surrender. The emperor will know your loyalty." Then he packed his gear, checked his rifle, and moved deeper into the heart of Lubang. The world was now hunting him, but he still believed that the war was not over, not until his commander told him so. By 1973, the story of Hiroo Onoda had become a legend, a ghost tale whispered in classrooms, bars, and newsrooms across Japan. A soldier, still fighting a war that ended before most people in the country were even born. A man who lived in the jungle, armed, alert, and invisible. To some, he was a tragic relic of the past. To others, he was a symbol of the unbreakable Japanese spirit. To everyone, he was a mystery that refused to die. After Kinshichi Kozuka's death in 1972, the Japanese government once again sent search parties to Lubang Island. Planes dropped leaflets printed with photographs, letters from Onoda's family, even old army friends. Loudspeakers echoed through the forest. "Lieutenant Onoda, Japan has surrendered. The war is over. Please come home." But to Onoda, these weren't messages of peace. They were psychological warfare. He had been trained to resist deception, to trust only his commanding officer's direct order. And so he stayed hidden, surviving off coconuts, wild bananas, and the occasional stolen cow. Every night, he cleaned his rifle by candlelight and checked the perimeter. The jungle had taken everything from him: companions, youth, sanity, but not his mission. He was the last soldier of the empire, and he would not abandon his post. Then came Norio Suzuki, a 24-year-old Japanese adventurer, idealistic and restless. In 1974, he told his friends before leaving Tokyo, "I'm going to look for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman," in that order. People laughed, thinking he was crazy. But Suzuki wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing connection. He wanted to find the lost fragments of Japan's spirit, buried under decades of modern comfort. Armed with little more than a backpack, a tent, and a camera, he arrived on Lubang Island in February 1974. The locals warned him, "The Japanese soldier still lives in the jungle. He's dangerous." But Suzuki simply smiled. "He's not dangerous. He's loyal. For days, he hiked through the jungle, sleeping under the stars, leaving notes in Japanese along trails and creeks. Onoda-san, I am Japanese, too. The war is over. I've come to talk. On the fourth day, as he crossed a stream, he felt eyes on him. Sharp, calculating, predatory. Slowly, from behind a cluster of trees, a man emerged. He wore a faded uniform patched with bamboo leaves. His rifle, a Type 99 Arisaka, gleamed as if it had been cleaned that morning. His face was weathered but calm, his movements disciplined. "Who are you?" the man demanded in Japanese. "Norio Suzuki," he replied, raising his hands. "I'm Japanese. I came to find you, Lieutenant Onoda." There was a long silence. Onoda's eyes narrowed, scanning him from head to toe. The stranger's accent, his mannerisms, they were real. Finally, Onoda spoke. "If you are truly Japanese, why are you here?" Suzuki smiled softly. "Because my country forgot you. I came to bring you home." For the first time in 30 years, Hiroo Onoda lowered his rifle. Over the next few days, the two men talked for hours in the jungle, sitting by a fire Onoda barely allowed to burn. Suzuki told him about Japan's peace, its prosperity, the Olympics, and men landing on the moon. Onoda listened, silent, skeptical. "I don't believe it," he said. "How can Japan be at peace when I have not been relieved of duty?" Suzuki realized what had to happen. Someone Onoda trusted, his commanding officer, would have to return. He promised, "I will bring your commander here, Lieutenant. I swear it." Onoda nodded slowly. "Then I will wait. Until I receive my orders, my mission continues." Suzuki returned to Japan and immediately contacted the government and military archives. It took weeks of bureaucracy and disbelief before they located Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the very man who had given Onoda his orders in 1944. Taniguchi was now a quiet bookseller, living in Japan's countryside. When officials approached him, he wept. "He's still out there? My God, it's my fault." Determined to finish what he had started 30 years earlier, Taniguchi agreed to travel to the Philippines. In March 1974, after nearly 3 decades of war, the impossible happened. Major Taniguchi and a Japanese delegation landed on Lubang Island. Guided by Suzuki, they reached the same jungle clearing where Onoda had lived for half his life. When Onoda saw his former commander, he froze. Then, slowly, he saluted. Taniguchi, his voice trembling, read the official order. "Lieutenant Onoda, in accordance with the command of the Imperial General Headquarters, all combat activities are to cease immediately. Japan has surrendered. You are relieved of all duties." For a moment, the forest was silent. Then Onoda stood straight, his eyes moist but unblinking. "Sir," he said, "I have fulfilled my mission." He removed his rifle, sword, and grenades, and handed them over. After 29 years, Hiroo Onoda finally laid down his arms. On March 10, 1974, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, Imperial Japanese Army intelligence officer, missing in action for 29 years, walked out of the jungles of Lubang Island wearing a tattered uniform, his rifle polished to perfection, and his sword still strapped to his side. As he stepped into the sunlight, Filipino soldiers surrounded him, cautious but curious. Cameras clicked. The man before them looked like a relic from another century, thin, composed, and strangely regal. He had entered the jungle as a 22-year-old lieutenant. He was leaving it as a 52-year-old legend. When news reached Japan, the entire nation froze. Television stations interrupted broadcasts to announce, "Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, who continued fighting for Japan until 1974, has been found alive." Millions watched in disbelief. Children who had grown up never knowing war suddenly saw its ghost, alive, human, and disciplined beyond comprehension. Elderly veterans wept. Younger generations asked, why didn't he know? The Japanese government immediately arranged for Onoda's return. But before he left the Philippines, he performed one final act of loyalty. He surrendered his sword, rifle, and 500 rounds of ammunition to President Ferdinand Marcos. Marcos, moved by the soldiers' unwavering faith, pardoned Onoda for all actions committed during his years in hiding. In a formal ceremony, Onoda bowed deeply and said, "I have been faithful to my orders. I am sorry for the trouble I caused." When he finally boarded the plane to Tokyo, the world watched. As the aircraft ascended, Onoda stared out the window, seeing clouds for the first time in decades, feeling the weight of a world that had moved on without him. The flight lasted only a few hours. The distance between the jungle and civilization was short, but the gap between 1944 and 1974 felt infinite. When he arrived at Haneda Airport, tens of thousands of people waited to see him. Flashbulbs exploded, reporters shouted questions, and cameras followed his every move. He stepped out, saluted, and bowed deeply before the crowd. To them, he was a hero, a samurai who had embodied loyalty beyond reason. To him, they were strangers living in a land he no longer recognized. Japan had changed. The empire was gone. The emperor, once a divine being to whom Onoda had dedicated his soul, was now a constitutional monarch who spoke of peace. Streets were filled with cars, televisions, and Western fashions. The air buzzed not with wartime slogans, but with pop songs and advertisements. When he saw women in short skirts and men with long hair, he whispered to a reporter, "I don't understand. This is not the Japan I fought for." In interviews, Onoda spoke calmly, with the precision of a soldier giving a debriefing. "I was ordered to stay, so I stayed. It's as simple as that," he said. A soldier does not surrender because he is tired. A soldier obeys until his commander tells him otherwise. But behind that stoic mask, he felt a deep dislocation, a kind of cultural vertigo. He had stepped from 1945 straight into a futuristic world, one that seemed to have erased everything he had believed in. The young people adored him, calling him the last samurai. Yet, privately, Onoda felt alienated. He once told a journalist, "I survived 30 years in the jungle, but I don't know how to survive in this new Japan." For the government and the media, Onoda was both an embarrassment and a miracle. He symbolized Japan's militaristic past, something the nation had tried to bury, but also its indomitable spirit. His face appeared on magazine covers. His story became front-page news around the world. Publishers offered him money for his memoirs. TV stations begged for interviews. Politicians sent letters of respect. But at night, Onoda lay awake in his hotel room, unable to sleep on a mattress after decades on the ground. The silence of the city was too loud. The electric lights too bright. He missed the rhythm of the jungle, the sound of rain, the pulse of duty, the clarity of purpose. Soon after, he published his autobiography, No Surrender, My 30-Year War. In it, he explained his mindset with chilling honesty. "We believed Japan would return. Every leaflet, every message from the outside, we thought it was a trick. I did what I was trained to do: resist, survive, and obey." The book became a bestseller, both inspiring and horrifying readers. For many, it was not just the story of a soldier. It was a mirror reflecting Japan's lost decades of identity. By late 1974, Onoda stood once more before Emperor Hirohito. He bowed low and said, "Your Majesty, I have returned. I am sorry I took so long." The emperor, now an old man in a business suit, nodded gently. "You have done your duty," he said. "Now live in peace." But peace was something Onoda no longer understood. The crowds eventually dispersed. The headlines faded. But for Hiroo Onoda, life after the jungle was far more disorienting than life within it. He had survived 30 years of warfare, hunger, and isolation. Yet peace was something he could not endure. In the quiet corners of his hotel room, surrounded by televisions, elevators, and fluorescent lights, he felt a deeper kind of fear. The world had moved on without him, and he no longer knew his place within it. In 1975, Onoda began a slow reintroduction into Japanese society. He met his family for the first time in 3 decades. His parents were gone. His younger brother had grown old. Strangers wept and bowed before him on the streets. Students saluted him as if he were a living monument. But beneath the admiration, he sensed pity for a man trapped in the past. He tried to live normally. He wore suits instead of uniforms. He learned how to use money again, how to ride the subway, how to eat at a restaurant without first scanning the exits. But he couldn't escape the feeling that everything around him was artificial. Once, while standing on a crowded Tokyo street, he told a journalist quietly, "When I see the neon lights, I feel as though I'm dreaming. The war was real. This feels like fiction." His memoir, No Surrender, My 30-Year War, became an international sensation. Readers were fascinated by his discipline, horrified by his isolation, and divided over what he represented. Was he a hero, or a man blinded by obsolete loyalty? Intellectuals debated his story as a national metaphor. To some, Onoda was the embodiment of the old Japan, devoted, unyielding, bound to hierarchy and honor. To others, he was a tragic reminder of the madness of obedience. Onoda didn't care about their debates. He was tired of being a symbol. He wanted to be a man again. In 1975, he visited the Philippines once more, this time not as a soldier, but as a civilian. He personally apologized to the families of villagers harmed during his long war. Standing before them in formal Japanese attire, he bowed deeply, saying, "I did only what I believed was my duty as a soldier. I ask for your forgiveness." The Filipinos, remarkably, forgave him. President Marcos himself received him with respect, acknowledging the sincerity of his repentance. Still, Onoda's guilt lingered. He told reporters afterward, "For 30 years I fought against people who were never truly my enemies. I cannot erase that." Seeking escape, he left Japan in 1975 and moved to Brazil, where he purchased a cattle ranch in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul. The wide, open fields and endless skies reminded him of freedom, of the raw simplicity of life he had once known in the jungle. There, he learned Portuguese, rode horses, and worked the land with the same discipline he had once applied to military duty. Locals described him as quiet, polite, and tireless, a man who rose before dawn and never complained. He began to feel alive again, not as a soldier, but as a man who could command his own destiny. Yet even in Brazil, the war never fully left him. He slept lightly, always with a knife nearby. He taught local workers survival tactics, jungle navigation, and field discipline. When they laughed and said he was too serious, he only smiled faintly and replied, "A man who stops being ready for danger stops being alive." In the 1980s, Onoda returned occasionally to Japan for lectures and interviews. His message was no longer about war. It was about resilience and purpose. He began visiting schools, urging young Japanese to develop mental strength and a sense of identity. "The greatest battle," he would tell students, "is the battle to stay true to yourself in a world that changes too quickly." But despite his calm words, he often criticized modern Japan. He lamented that young people lacked conviction, that the nation had traded discipline for comfort. He once said in an interview, "When I returned, I realized Japan had lost something. We became rich, but we forgot our spirit. Without conviction, a man is already defeated." His words resonated deeply in a society struggling with the cost of success. Many admired him. Others saw him as a relic preaching from another era. But to all, he remained a man out of time, a soldier who had returned from the past to remind the future of what conviction looked like. In 1984, he founded the Onoda Shurzen-juku, Onoda Nature School, in Japan, a youth camp dedicated to teaching survival skills, discipline, and mental resilience. He told the children, "I want you to experience nature the way I did, to understand fear and strength. The jungle taught me everything about life." For him, it was a way to transform 3 decades of isolation into something useful, to turn suffering into instruction. The soldier had finally found peace, not through surrender, but through teaching. Still, late at night, when the wind moved through the trees outside his ranch in Brazil, he sometimes felt the jungle calling him back, the rustle of leaves, the weight of rain, the phantom voice of Kozuka whispering, "Lieutenant, what are our orders?" And in the quiet darkness, Onoda would close his eyes and murmur, "The mission is complete. Rest now." By the 1990s, Hiroo Onoda had lived through a world unrecognizable to the young soldier who had stepped onto Lubang Island in 1944. Japan had become a global economic powerhouse, cities filled with neon lights, skyscrapers, and the constant hum of progress. Yet for Onoda, the passage of decades had been a study in contrasts, the enduring discipline of his own past versus the ephemeral, comfort-driven life of modern society. He had grown older, taller in stature through his own inner sense of duty rather than physical presence. His hair had turned silver, his face deeply lined, yet his posture remained erect, as if every vertebra remembered the jungle's rigidity. The world saw him as a living legend, a symbol of loyalty, But Onoda saw himself first as a man who had survived 30 years of war that no one else remembered. He divided his time between his ranch in Brazil and trips to Japan. At the ranch, he immersed himself in work, teaching youth the discipline of agriculture, survival, and respect for nature. His Onoda Nature School continued to grow in popularity. Children and teenagers were captivated by stories of a man who had survived 30 years in the jungle. But Onoda rarely glorified war. He spoke of discipline, responsibility, and self-reliance. The jungle is the greatest teacher, he would say. It does not lie. It does not cheat. It only tests you, and only you can pass. In Japan, he became a fixture on television documentaries, interviews, and educational programs. He often appeared alongside scholars debating the meaning of obedience, duty, and loyalty in modern society. Onoda's perspective was nuanced. He did not glorify his guerrilla actions on Lubang, but he never expressed regret for fulfilling orders given by his commander. Despite his fame, Onoda remained a man out of time. He observed modern Japan with a critical eye. He lamented that material comfort often replaced personal discipline, and that younger generations lacked a sense of purpose. Yet he also recognized progress. Schools, hospitals, and infrastructure had risen from the ruins of war. He reflected on the paradox of his own life. I fought for a world that no longer exists, but I survived to see a new world. That is both a blessing and a burden. Philosophically, Onoda had shifted from obedience to reflection. He recognized that life was more than military duty. He began keeping journals not of strategy, but of human behavior, nature, and lessons learned. He wrote about patience, resilience, and the importance of finding one's own path in a rapidly changing world. In the late 1990s, he was invited to speak at universities, sharing his story as a cautionary tale and inspiration. Students asked about loyalty, war, and survival. Onoda's answers were calm and measured. Loyalty is important, he said, but so is understanding. A soldier must obey orders, but a man must also know when the world has changed. Balance is the key. He spoke rarely of Kozuka, Akatsu, or Shimada, though he never forgot them. In interviews, he emphasized their courage and discipline. He also spoke about forgiveness, for himself, for the villagers affected by his raids, and for a world that had long forgotten the war he still carried in his mind. By the 2000s, Onoda was in his late 70s, a relic not only of World War II, but of a mindset that had vanished from the modern world. Scholars, journalists, and veterans of all ages sought him out. Some were inspired, others puzzled. How could a man dedicate 3 decades to a mission that no longer existed? He replied simply, I did what I believed was right. Perhaps that is not for others to judge. Yet his story resonated globally. In Europe, students read about him in history textbooks. In Asia, soldiers studied him as an example of extreme discipline. In Japan, he became a symbol of resilience, integrity, and the costs of unwavering duty. Even in his final years, he remained active, visiting schools, lecturing, and writing letters. His philosophy was consistent: respect, self-reliance, courage, and reflection. But he also carried a quiet melancholy, a sense that he had lived through a time no one else could truly understand. In the end, Hiroo Onoda was not just a soldier. He was a bridge between eras, a man who had survived the extremes of loyalty and isolation, and who had carried the lessons of the past into the modern world. As the 21st century dawned, Hiroo Onoda had become more than a man. He was a living emblem of unwavering loyalty, resilience, and discipline. Yet despite his fame, he remained deeply humble. He did not seek medals, parades, or accolades. The world had honored him, but he had always acted according to a personal code far older than modern recognition. Onoda spent his later years primarily at his cattle ranch in Brazil, surrounded by the land that had become his sanctuary after decades of war and displacement. The wide horizons reminded him of the forests of Lubang, yet here there was peace, safety, and a rhythm governed by the seasons rather than orders. He rose early, worked tirelessly, and taught younger generations the values he had carried all his life: discipline, responsibility, courage, and respect for nature. Although he lived far from Japan, Onoda never severed his connection to his homeland. He frequently returned to give lectures, meet students, and attend commemorative events. During these trips, he often reflected on his unique life. A soldier who had fought a war that had ended decades before the world knew it, and a man who had outlasted both the soldiers and nations around him. He continued to emphasize a critical point. Loyalty and courage must be tempered with understanding. In interviews, he said, "A soldier must follow orders, but a human being must also understand when the world has changed. The balance between duty and awareness defines a life well lived." He also remained a symbol of reconciliation. Onoda often revisited Lubang Island to meet the families of villagers affected by his raids. He apologized personally, bowing in deep humility, and was received with respect and forgiveness. These visits were never publicized widely. They were acts of conscience rather than spectacle. In Japan, his story was immortalized in books, documentaries, and films. Students studied his life as part of World War II history. Scholars debated the moral and philosophical questions his life raised. When does obedience become madness? How far should loyalty extend? Yet for many, Onoda was a living connection to a time now long gone, a reminder of the human capacity for endurance. Even in his later years, he maintained physical vigor. He rode horses, worked the ranch, and walked long distances, keeping alive the habits honed in the jungles of Lubang. Visitors often remarked on his sharp eyes and disciplined posture. The decades had not dulled the precision of a man trained for survival. Hiroo Onoda passed away on January 16, 2014, at the age of 91. He died quietly at his home in Brazil, surrounded by the land he loved, far from the jungles that had defined so much of his life. News of his death was met with worldwide reflection. Headlines called him the last soldier of World War II, the man who fought a lost war, and Japan's last samurai. Across the globe, people remembered the story of a man who had survived 3 decades of isolation, never abandoning his duty. His life was a testament not only to survival, but also to the enduring human spirit, moral conviction, and the complex interplay between loyalty and personal ethics. Onoda's legacy endures in multiple ways. Historical memory. He reminds the world of the human stories hidden in the vast narratives of war. Philosophical reflection. His life prompts debates on duty, obedience, and conscience. Education and mentorship. His Onoda Nature School continues to teach youth survival skills, discipline, and respect for nature. Popular culture. Books, films, and documentaries recount his extraordinary journey, inspiring fascination and introspection alike. Ultimately, Hiroo Onoda is remembered not simply as a soldier, but as a man who lived the extremes of loyalty, endurance, and moral conviction. His life poses enduring questions. What does it mean to obey? To survive? To remain true to one's beliefs in a world that no longer shares them? Even decades after the war's end, Onoda's story continues to resonate. A bridge between past and present, a cautionary tale, and an inspiration. In remembering him, the world does more than honor a soldier. It honors the remarkable resilience of the human spirit.